Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 92. Charles.
Thank you for agreeing to see me, Mr. Da Costa,
Charles said, motoring into the man's office.
In light of recent events and the rumors that have reached my ears, I thought it prudent,
Roberto admitted. Charles had looked into the young man when John Proudstar had recommended him as a potential ally in South America. Like Tony and Warren, Roberto was the son of a millionaire businessman. Like Warren, he had manifested young, though not so young as Bobby and John had. Unlike Warren, Roberto's manifestation had been rather public, taking place in the middle of a soccer game. Roberto's father had secluded his son for quite some time afterward, though whether that had been an attempt to protect his son or something else, Charles was uncertain. Roberto had re-emerged shortly after his 18th birthday and had taken up a position in his father's company. Interestingly, he had never interacted with either Tony or Warren. While that could easily be explained by Roberto being based out of Brazil, there could be less innocent reasons. The questions Charles had about the man would be why he'd arranged to meet him. Charles did not think he was outright evil. He did not think Proudstar would recommend someone like that to him. But that did not mean that Roberto did not harbor a degree of internalized racism or prejudice against mutants. He'd hardly be the first mutant to think ill of themselves. Likewise, he could simply have a personality ill-suited to leading a combat team.
We find ourselves, Charles said, and by we I mean all of Earth, in a rather sticky spot, Mr. Da Costa. The aliens that invaded New York, however briefly, were not alone. While that attempt was turned aside, their general fully intends to not just conquer Earth, but wipe out all life both here and everywhere else he can reach. Roberto sat back in his office chair. That is disturbing news, he said. I presume there is more information to be had, and a plan of action being implemented.
Yes, to both, Charles said. In brief, Norse mythology is not entirely wild stories. There are indeed 9 realms, 7 of which are currently inhabited by sapient people, including our own. 2 are apparently now empty wastelands. While it was not explicitly explained so, I believe the 9 realms are connected because they are similar enough that the residents of the realms can live on the other realms with minimal or no assistance of any kind. Roberto nodded. Makes a certain amount of sense. So the men identified as Thor and Loki in the news are the Thor and Loki of legend, then? Yes and no. Yes, in that they both exist and are from Asgard. No, in that they are not gods, and I have been given to understand that most of the tales in Norse mythology are at best embellished, to the point of ridiculousness, and at the worst completely false. Charles told him. I won't go into full details, as the story is rather long, but Loki fell in love with death, and in order to win her hand, seeks to send her gifts. Roberto made a face. And by that, I presume you mean a lot of deaths? Quite. Some 4,000 years or so ago, he was banished from the other realms, which I was informed is a process that renders the banished being unable to enter the realm they've been banished from. Unfortunately, both at that time and this, Earth is unable to perform this process. Do we know why? Roberto asked. Put simply, we're not united enough, Charles told him. One of the other commonalities of the realms is that each has a king or queen who were chosen for the honor by an object native to the realm. They rule over all their people. These items only appear at a point in the realms who were chosen for the honor by an object native to the realm. They rule over all their people. These items only appear at a point in the realm's history when its people have begun to unify. And we here on Earth are nowhere near such a thing, Roberto said. And I presume that while this Thanos cannot enter the other realms, his army can? Quite. If he conquers Earth, he can use our world as a base of operations from which to strike at the other realms, Charles said. And while the various governments of Earth will no doubt rally to the cause, well, further steps are being taken. The other realms are preparing for war as well, and will come to our aid. Roberto nodded. And I presume you are contacting what of, shall I say, our people, you will contact with? Quite so.
Mutants possess unique abilities that will be of great value in defending the planet. That doing so will improve human-mutant relations is not an inconsiderable bonus. I have contacts on most of the continents, save here in Australia, and have asked them to gather however many of their fellows as are willing that they can find. John Bradstore pointed me in your direction. It is my hope that you would do likewise, and if you do not feel yourself competent to lead such a team, you might know of someone who could. Charles said. I am perhaps not suited to leadership of a combat unit, Roberto admitted, but gathering like minds, ensuring they have the materials they need, and fostering someone who does have that sort of ability, that I can do. Then he smiled. Not to mention offering my own not inconsiderable abilities to the task at hand. I shall begin sending out suitable persons as soon as possible. Charles nodded. He was a little disappointed that DaCosta didn't seem interested in leading a team, but pledging to gather a group together and support them monetarily was nearly as good. If he could find a competent leader, whether he got dragged into the role kicking and screaming thanks to circumstance or it was someone else, so much the better. Almost a full week after having met with Mr. DaCosta, Charles finally got a chance to review the reports coming in from his various friends and allies. Jean-Paul Bibert had a team of 6 thus far, including his sister, and had begun training. The Guthrie clan, of course, had been training from the beginning, but Sam Guthrie had found a few unrelated mutants in the area and added them to the clan roster, forming the largest team at a full dozen. Pete Wisdom's group, which was less a unified team and more a loose confederation of adult individuals all over the age of 25, willing to work together when big problems came up, was actually the next largest, at 8. They were spread out over most of Europe. Mikhail Rasputin's group was the smallest thus far, with just himself and 2 others, one of them his little sister. But he was having to be careful and quiet about recruiting. Russia might not be the bastion of communism it had once been, but a lot of the ideals that had been fostered in communist Russia still lingered in the populace, and Russia was one of the most unwelcoming places for mutants because of it. Carol Danvers had, to his surprise, come up with 5 people beside herself in the United States military and was following rumors of more. Finding them a way to train together was going to be problematic, though, at least if they wanted to keep the group out of the clutches of the sorts of people who had experimented on Logan anyway. Interestingly, Betsy Braddock had opted to join forces with Sean Cassidy. Charles wasn't quite sure what to make of that particular team-up, but he had no fears as to the competence of their team in a fight. They'd found 3 people in their late teens willing to throw their skills into the pot. John Proudstar, incredibly, had located 5 Native American mutants scattered throughout Canada and the United States, which was more than Charles had thought he'd find. Shiro Yoshida was being picky, if Charles read that report right, if it could be called a report at all. More of a, here, you filth, see how much better I am than you, taunt. Really. There was a distinct tone of choosing those most worthy to defend our great empire, which carried the implication of not taking anyone with combat applicable powers and the desire to fight to defend the planet into his team. While in less dire circumstances, picking those you liked best for your team was completely acceptable. This was hardly the time to be so selective. Every capable fighter was needed. He was going to have to send someone to Japan to suss that situation out. Probably Loki, once he and the others had returned to the planet. If anyone could smack some sense into Shiro without pissing him off or turning him petulant, it would be Loki. T'Challa, of course, had lost absolutely no time in not only gathering mutants to him, but in gearing Wakanda up for war. Much to Charles' never-ending amusement, Roberto had located 2 fellow mutants in just under a week's time. And if the report Charles had gotten was any indication, Roberto was going to end up leading the group despite thinking he wasn't right for the job. There was a certain tone to the letter that Charles recognized from some of Scott's earliest notes about the X-Men team. A sort of exasperated irritation and a sense of, if you want something done right, do it yourself. That had seen Scott half-leading training even before he'd had the visor to control his optic blasts. Charles had even gotten word from the twins and Lorna. As he had guessed, they had opted not to form a team. Most of those
in the know as to the three's paternity would have conniptions about them having a team, fearing the worst. Still, even just the three of them were formidable, and Lorna was stepping up her training with her powers. It was extremely unlikely she'd be a match for her father by the time Thanos arrived, but every little bit would help. They had also indicated that if a group could be found that wouldn't look at them askance, they'd be amenable to joining that team. Charles was more than slightly tempted to recommend them to the Avengers. He sincerely doubted anyone on that team would hold their paternity against them, especially when the three of them had none of Eric's megalomania. That said, he had decided not to. The Avengers had quite enough on their plates between forging the existing members into a cohesive team, coordinating with the realms, dispensing justice to Sergeant Barnes' tormentors, and, Charles strongly suspected, dealing with the political storm that was brewing. Because a political storm was definitely brewing. The UK was, rather predictably, being one of the sensible ones. They'd immediately begun to mobilize in the wake of the invasion. Someone in their government had, rightly, seen the invasion as a test for both sides prior to the full engagement. The US, while less coordinated and unified in purpose, was also mobilizing. There were a few folks in high government positions squawking about preparing to fight aliens rather than attempting diplomacy, but they were largely being shouted down by the rest of the government and the entirety of the military complex. Canada seemed to be following the lead of the UK and USA, though somewhat lackadaisically thus far. In fact, most of the Commonwealth was following the UK's lead in mobilizing. The rest of the world? Not so much. Charles was not so connected to the governments of countries outside the Commonwealth and the USA, but it was easy enough to figure out who was gearing up and who wasn't. A few Charles knew might be gearing up, but not to defend the planet. No, a few folks were gearing up to take advantage of the situation one way or another. Unfortunately, Charles didn't have the slightest idea how to light a fire under the governments who weren't gearing up for war. Most of them would stick their metaphorical fingers in their ears and chant, la la la, not listening, if approached by an American or someone with even the smallest connection to an American. Some of that lot would, in point of fact, cheer an invader on, so long as they trashed the USA first. So most of the people Charles could think of to send a warning would get very short shrift. Well, most. He had little doubt Tony could annoy them into preparing for war just to get rid of him, and those he couldn't annoy into compliance, Loki could likely convince. Still, that meant it would be a problem put on the Avengers' plate on top of everything else they'd be dealing with. He didn't envy them the explanation that they'd preemptively agreed to things in the name of Earth and her defense with the other realms. That was going to cause quite a kerfuffle. Charles honestly didn't know who'd scream the loudest, the USA on friendly countries over Americans making deals for the planet, or the USA when they figured out the deals were made for the planet and not for the benefit of the USA alone. Both revelations promised to be highly entertaining.